It's November Tynwald next week, and probably the most important item is what changes are needed to ensure the National Insurance Fund and the pensions it helps to pay remain sustainable in the future. Later in the programme, Treasury Minister Allinson explains the changes he's considering, which include replacing the triple lock promise for future pension increases and increasing the options for use of the National Insurance Fund. We also hear from former Treasury Minister Eddie Teare, who explains what previous administrations have done. And shortly, we'll hear from Tim Glover, who explains his motion on public services. But first, Rob Collister is picking up a petition.
Yeah, this particular petition is being presented, or I'm presenting it on behalf of the Dyslexia Advocacy Group. They originally presented a petition back in 2020. The department at the time undertook a public consultation, and there was clear gaps within the education system. Unfortunately, those promises that were made back in 2020, in fact, promises have been made right the way back to 2012. So this year they presented a further petition, and having spoke to the group and having suffered from dyslexia myself as a young child, I thought it was absolutely the right thing to do is to pick this up and to ask Tynwald to set up a committee to look at this topic, because it goes beyond what the department would describe as literacy difficulties. We should never be afraid to use the word dyslexia and to offer that extra support, especially for young children, in order to give them the perfect start in life, not just in the workplace, but also life generally.
We know, though, that the Department of Education has at least once, maybe twice now, applied to get extra funding for additional educational needs, and I'm guessing dyslexia is one of the areas that would be covered by that. So far, Treasury, and I suppose Tynwald, because Tynwald supports the budget, hasn't backed the department's call. So I'm guessing this is going to cost money, is it?
I hope not. It's about support. It's about a wraparound service. Yes, there may be some additional teaching, training, and there may be some additional support needed. But also, more importantly, we need extra information to be given to parents. There's a lot of parents out there that are very concerned because they don't know where to go, where to get help. Fortunately, there is a lot of information online to help children that have dyslexia. Now, we have to remember that 1 in 10 children in the UK have some form of dyslexia, and there is over 1 million children in the UK with dyslexia that hasn't been diagnosed. So it's really vitally important we set this committee up, that we take evidence, we actually listen to the petitioners, listen to concerned parents, also get an opportunity to listen to teachers, because teachers are saying they also need support. I will just add an extra point in, Phil, because if you go back through the Department of Education's own annual reports, there's never any mention of dyslexia or even learning difficulties. But suddenly in the 24 and 25 annual report, they have actually added 2 sections in now about literacy difficulties, and it's good to hear that. And I think that's come as a result not just from this petition, but also the interviews I've given recently. So in that report, they clearly say that they will provide extra guidance to teachers. They will start to provide guidance to parents, but that information will not be available until March 2025 or till September 2025. Even though they've taken that action, I think it's vitally important that we still proceed with this committee, because promises have been made in the past and they've fallen on deaf ears. I think we should push forward with the committee, really seriously look at the topic of dyslexia and offer support where we can.
I'm guessing then that you have some hints that government may not support the petition or the motion, bearing in mind what you've said, that they're already doing quite a bit of work behind the scenes on this.
Well, it sounds like they've just added a bit of lip service in, because I have been so strong in my comments previously, and I think this petition group have been so strong. The Dyslexia Advocacy Group, they meet regular. They listen to parents. I think we now have a duty as parliamentarians, but we also have a duty as an island to seriously look at dyslexia, because if you actually go back through history, some of the most famous people in the world have had some form of dyslexia. Winston Churchill, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. There is some amazing people who have influenced all of our lives have had some form of dyslexia. So we should never be afraid to use the word. The key part here is identify it early, put in place a framework that actually supports child early on in life, and to then, as I've mentioned, give them the best possible start in life.
Onken MHK, Rob Collister there. Next up, Tim Glover.
This was actually going to be originally in October sitting, but I withdrew it because we had the royal visit and the Chief Minister and the Cabinet Office Minister, central government, were not there. They were out in Peel with that royal visit. So I've put it to November now. It was one of the main thrusts at the government conference, one of the main announcements that was made. So, like other colleagues, I feel bring it to Tynwald so it can be aired in Tynwald as well, and get the views of members on what they see as the future of public services on the Isle of Man.
And I suppose the obvious question then is, what do you hope to get out of the debate? Obviously you'll get members' views, but do you have a particular line on this yourself that you're trying to pursue?
There's a couple of things that I've and have been mentioned in the presentation that came, of course, from the CEO, Andy Ralphs, and there were some key questions asked. If public services are to be sustainable into the future, then real change is needed, was an opening gambit that was made. And the questions...
And nobody could argue with that, really, could they?
No, not at all. But the questions that were then asked, what services do we deliver and who is best placed to deliver them? Who pays for what and what are the levels of service that government can afford? How do we best organise ourselves to be more efficient? And single legal entity, that came up as well. What issues are we really trying to resolve and what is best for the Isle of Man? Now, I can see the arguments for single legal entity. I've argued that previously as well. That we were told at the government conference wouldn't be coming in immediately, but it would be looked at once again.
And that's kind of code to say the Chief Minister doesn't like it, or possibly Council of Ministers aren't signed up to it, so it'll have to wait until a different Council of Ministers.
You could be right on that.
But in terms of some of that reorganising
to talk about, and also it's the size and scope of government, you know.
And how do you do that? Because there's been so many attempts over the past decades, particularly since money has become obviously more tight, since 2008 and the VAT loss. Lots and lots of attempts have been made at trying to sort this, and what seems to end up happening is that certain departments have their budgets significantly cut, but then you have the health department outspending just about everybody, and nobody's going to say we need to cut health, are they? No one's going to say we can have fewer health services, and yet that's effectively what a lot of this is all about, because if health spending was brought into control, I'm guessing that revenues would be able to catch up.
Yeah, and I was encouraged that Mr. Ralphs talked about a real focus on digitalisation, and that is a way of trying to streamline products and the whole essence is that public service has to put the customer first, the public first, and make things as easy as possible. And there are, without question, certain things that are really difficult to actually get through. So, the tell government once is a big theme, I think, throughout this. If you've given your change of address or your details to a department, well, other departments really shouldn't be then having to ask for exactly the same information. So there are various ways to make the whole experience a lot easier, a lot more streamlined, user-friendly, and I think as well that will help build up trust as well again in government, because that is clearly a subject that is out there at the moment. if government's working properly and working for the people, that's got to be a good thing.
Do you think people get the complexity, though, of what government tries to deliver? And I suppose that's a question, really, as much as anything, to Tynwald members. Do you think they fully understand that every time a motion is put to Tynwald and recommendations flow out of the motion, select committees report back and say, oh, we must do this, we must do the other, and the next thing you know, hard-pressed civil servants who have had their budget slashed, and probably several of their colleagues have moved on and not been replaced, are left with trying to implement even more stuff than perhaps they had maybe 10, 20 years ago to do.
Well, this is why I brought it as just a general debate. Because that's a far cleaner way of doing it. It is an exercise that Andy Ralphs has been charged with undertaking. But it's also a number of Tynwald members were a little bit upset that things were announced at the government conference as opposed to being announced in Tynwald. Dr. Michelle Hayward was one who was vocal on it. So this is the opportunity really for Tynwald to put their ideas forward in the hope that they are of help to Andy Ralphs, who is the man tasked with doing this by the Chief Minister.
That was Tim Glover, MHK. Despite attempts to stabilise the National Insurance Fund, projections still show it being depleted in 20 years' time. So what is Treasury Minister Alex Allinson going to do about it? You're not actually introducing anything. There's no vote in Tynwald to actually deliver any significant change at the moment.
No, absolutely not, Phil. And thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. We've got a paper that Treasury have produced. We're going to have hopefully a decent debate on it in Tynwald. And really what we're trying to do from a Treasury perspective is get people to understand what the National Insurance Scheme is, how it runs, what the National Insurance Fund is, how important it is for our country in many different ways. But also look at the projections we've got that if we do nothing, this fund's going to run out by 2047 and actually peak in 2027. And then go on a downward curve. So I think there is that fiscal responsibility to sometimes look at these issues, look at the various options, and this whole debate isn't about setting policy. It's certainly not about raiding the NI fund. It's certainly not about criticising pensioners or trying to reduce pensions or welfare cuts at all, or benefit cuts. What it's trying to do is explain the system we've got at the moment and explain that I think we need to make some decisions. They may be difficult decisions now to sustain the fund and sustain pensions retaining their value in the future.
Many people say, well, I've paid in all my life. My pot of money is sat in there, and I expect to have a decent pension as a result. Are they wrong?
No, they're not. They have paid their stamp, and they should expect a pension that will keep them in a decent standard of living in their retirement. They have paid money in. The way the National Insurance Scheme works, though, isn't that every individual pensioner has got their individual pot. What happens is that every year working people and employers pay national insurance contributions, and that funds the pensions for that year for all those people who've retired. Some years there's a bit of a surplus and that goes into the fund. Some years, particularly this year where we've increased pensions quite significantly, the amount of money coming in doesn't quite match the amount of money coming out. So there'll be a drawdown from the fund. So it acts as a buffer for the good years and the less good years in terms of economic growth. So everyone should get a pension, and every pension should keep up with inflation and keep its value in terms of what it's worth. And I think that's absolutely right. But what we also have seen since the welfare state and since the National Insurance Scheme was started at the same time as the NHS in 1948 is our whole society has changed. We talk about demographics. Back in 1948, I think the average life expectancy of a man was probably in late 50s. Very few of them lived very, very long after they've retired because life was hard then. We had a whole range of illnesses, and people smoked and drank and everything like that. Now, with the average life expectancy, thank goodness, being a lot longer than that, people are living longer, so they're claiming pensions longer. Absolutely right, and absolutely right that they should get those pensions and they should keep their value. But we need to then look at how that is funded, because we also know that these ideas of dependency ratios and having less people paying in and more people claiming pensions has to be balanced in some ways. Otherwise, what we'll end up doing is taxing working people and working families and employers more and more to afford pensions that get more and more difficult to fund in the future. And I don't want to get to a stage whereby that balance goes and we actually have to start talking about benefit cuts.
I mean, there's so much that we could talk about here in relation to the NI fund and indeed pensions. If we go to the triple lock, I mean, this is something that you've very clearly trailed. But in terms of the budget, it was suggested the triple lock would go. You're still suggesting it. It's in as part of a consideration and a discussion. Now, a cynic might say the triple lock was introduced purely as an electoral advantage by the Tory government that introduced it. Others might say that actually triple lock was recognising that across Europe, the pensions paid in Britain and the Isle of Man are relatively low compared with counterparts in places like France, Germany and the like. And the triple lock effectively increases the pension more than would be the case if it was just about an inflationary increase. Removing the triple lock will have an impact on pensioners, though, won't it?
It could have an impact on some pensioners. So, again, one of the bits of the history of the National Insurance Scheme and the history of pensions is we've always been very closely linked to the adjacent Isle, to the United Kingdom. And we used to have exactly the same national insurance system as them, which was great because people were going backwards and forwards, and whether they paid in the UK or they paid here, they got exactly the same benefits. But what that did was wed us to the UK system. We had no option but to follow. We had no voice in terms of what we wanted out of it. We had to follow the UK. And I think it was in your time in Tynwald, back in 2016, that the split was made. The decision was made when the UK went to a single-tier pension system that actually we couldn't carry on following that. That it would be unaffordable, and also, again, we'd have no autonomy in terms of setting up pensions at all. So what happened was that a split was made. We have literally two different pension systems now. We have those people who've retired before 2019, who were on a pension system wedded to the UK because they've paid in, and we've got that shared pot there. And from 2019, we've got the new Manx State pension, and there's transitionary payments in between to balance it out to make sure that nobody's worse off. So we've got about 14,000 people under the old system, 6,000 people under the new system, and the new system we have the ability to decide rates and contributions, and also to deal with how that then affects the long-term stability of the NI fund, which is now over £1 billion, that is ring-fenced for providing pensions, providing other benefits, such as incapacity benefit, job seekers allowance, and some of the bereavement and maternity support. How we can sustain that, because we've had all these projections that show if we do nothing, it's going to run out, and then we are in a very difficult position as a society. So we have that ability to deal with those people who retired post 219, who actually get a really good pension, and it's established as a really good pension. There is nothing in our legislation, or in fact in UK legislation, to say thou shalt increase by the triple lock, and the triple lock is to do with the pensions will either go up by inflation. There's a floor of 2.5%, or average increase in earnings. And some years inflation is very, very low, and so it sticks at 2.5%. Some years inflation is very, very high, so that, this year it went up to almost 10%. Some years wages actually don't grow at all, and we've seen wage stagnation. Other years, particularly post-COVID, wages have actually overtaken inflation. So it sort of balances that out. And the triple lock's been incredibly effective in terms of lifting a large number of pensioners out of poverty. But looking forward, that's increasingly being paid for by working people paying into the system. And we've seen only over the last couple of weeks, when employers' NI contributions were increased in the UK, the economic effect that can have and the effect on inflation that can have. You also talk about countries such as France and Germany who do have far more generous pensions at lower pension ages. And when recently in France they suggested putting pension age up, there were riots in the streets and burning barricades. Everyone actually takes the sanctity of pension contributions and looking after our elders extremely seriously. But what I would advocate is they have a very different taxation structure. They have much higher income taxes, wealth taxes, capital gains taxes. They have contributions towards health and education. So it's difficult to compare like with like. But what we do know, particularly on the island, is that we have lifted by increasing pensions year on year a huge number of people out of poverty. There are still people who are struggling to get by for a whole range of reasons, particularly women who didn't contribute into the NI fund. And so out of all the pensioners, we've got about 1,300 getting income support at the moment. And there are other benefits for pensioners as well that they can get, attendance allowance as well. So that there are all those safeguards there, and the triple lock has been really important. But when we've looked at the various things we can do to sustain the fund, and I'm talking about making the retirement age higher, making the number of years you have to work to contribute to gain the pension. When we look at all those, the only way of dealing with the long-term sustainability of the funds to keep it at a decent level is either to increase the NI going in, by that we're talking about increasing that quite significantly both for people who work and their employers, or looking at the long-term payouts from the fund by looking at how we can increase benefits but at a more moderate rate so it balances what's coming in. And that's where that discussion about the triple lock comes in.
And of course, all this matters because, we're looking at the 24/5 estimated figures, where 152 million spent on retirement pension. There's a further, probably getting close to £100 million worth of add-ons for age addition, pension supplement, retirement pension premium, old person's pension, Manx state pension. Pension supplement, Manx state pension. We're talking getting close to £250 million a year gets spent on pensions. Yeah. It's a big amount of money, and if we get to a point in 2030, maybe 2040, whenever it was, that the fund runs out, all of that would have to be covered by taxpayers, either through taxes or through national insurance, which is effectively a tax anyway.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the expenditure, government expenditure, between a quarter and a third is benefits, and 80% of that is to pensioners, and quite rightly so. I'm not criticising that at all. I'm not blaming pensioners at all. That's the way it should be. But what we need to do is balance that with economic growth, with education for young people, for working people, because we know, not even before we saw the cost of living pressures and inflation and fuel prices going up, we know that since 2008, both here and on the adjacent isle, wages have stagnated, property prices have gone up. It's people trying to start a family are finding it harder and harder to own their own home, rent a home, start a family. And so we need to try to help them out as much as possible because they're the pensioners of tomorrow. But the reality is that they are paying the pensions of their parents and grandparents at the moment. And we need the paper talks about this idea of intergenerational fairness, that particularly at the moment there's constant references to the bank of mum and dad helping people out on the property ladder. That's fine, but they have achieved that by the increases in pensions, not just the state pension, but obviously occupational pensions as well. So it's trying to get that balance between the different generations so that everyone can profit from the prosperity of the Isle of Man, but also so we can keep the level of benefits available for pensioners. We can also have the welfare state as a safety net for those people who fall through the cracks for whatever reason.
You've suggested various options of things that can be done, all of which really are suggesting we need to move away from the triple lock. And there are various then alternatives suggested. One thing that I was surprised perhaps that isn't in there, I know it has been considered in the past, is incentivising people to work longer. There doesn't appear, maybe I missed it, but there doesn't appear to be anything in about that.
Yeah, we looked at making the retirement age longer, and actually that doesn't really help, because as people get older, for either physical or sometimes mental issues, they're less capable to do the work they could do in their 20s and 30s. We do have incentives for people to carry on working after retirement. So if you retire and you carry on working, you don't pay national insurance contributions because you've paid your stamp, you've paid the money in, you're drawing it out. If you're retired and you're working, you can't claim job seekers allowance. You can't claim a whole range of benefits that you pay into through NI. And so we don't charge retired people national insurance contributions. They can carry on working and that's not deducted, but they still get their pension. Now, interesting, we've got a motion in December Tynwald to demands that people who are pensioners who are working are charged national insurance. And that debate will be interesting. I mean, I think when you look at, I talk to pensioners in my constituency, and some of them want to work because they want to be part of the workforce, and they like the sociability of working. Others have to work because they find it very difficult to live off a state pension because of overheads and issues they may have. So I certainly don't think we should penalise people who want to work past the retirement age. We should encourage that, and from a medical point of view, particularly for men, retirement can be quite lethal sometimes. And actually keeping yourself active, both physically and mentally, is very, very healthy way to deal with your retirement.
There are 4 key principles in the document, and interestingly, former Minister and your Ramsey colleague, Mr. Hooper, has added an amendment to your motion which reads and supports the 4 principles outlined in the document. Now, obviously, as written, your motion doesn't require a decision. This effectively is Laurie Hooper saying, you know what, this is really important. We should at least endorse the 4 principles. And those 4 principles are that the value of the Manx state pension will be protected. Yep. The investment of the fund will be restricted. All expenditure from the fund should be fully funded through NI contributions, and the above policy principles will be reviewed every 5 years. They all seem pretty sound. Why did you not just ask that Tynwald supported those in the first place?
Well, as I say in the forward of this, what I wanted was a sort of national debate, and also people realising again what the NI fund is there for, and what the national insurance scheme does and what it provides. Because I think even it is quite complicated. There's a whole table in the report which shows all the different benefits that come out of the national insurance fund, and there are other benefits then that come out of general revenue. There's a hodgepodge. What it also describes is every year a small proportion of payments come straight to the NHS, around about £50 million in terms of an NHS allocation. And this goes right back to 1948 when it was all set up, because the Beveridge report and what came after that was all about securing the health and welfare of workers. It was making sure that if people couldn't work because of illness or unemployment, they were looked after. If they couldn't work because they were retired, they were looked after. And we had national health service that was free at point of need. And we've maintained retained that, quite rightly so. These principles are very much what Treasury think should go forward, and I don't necessarily want to wed Tynwald to that, but I wanted that discussion because people might disagree with it. They might say, all expenditure from the fund should be funded through the NI contributions. They might say no. We want to cut NI contribution, and we've seen that on the adjacent aisle in the previous government. They significantly cut national insurance contributions for employees. But that then, in some ways, creates a bit of a black hole for their current Chancellor, who said then had to put them up for employers to balance that out. We do review the fund every 5 years, and we use the actuarial department in the UK to look at these projections. And in the report, it shows that each time they've looked at it, the long-term prospects have got a little bit bleaker. And again, the first principle, the value of the pension should be protected. That it should go up each year, but it's looking at what indices you use. But it certainly should keep up with inflation. But in the past, and before the triple lock, there were a couple of times when inflation was almost zero, and then politicians had to say, well, should we not put up pensions this year? And pensioners saying, well, you may say inflation's zero, but I'm finding it more expensive to heat my home and fill my shopping basket. The investment of the fund will be restricted. Any money taken out of the fund is restricted by legislation, so it goes to benefits. A small part of it goes to the NHS allocation, but I cannot and will not raid the fund. Any money that's taken out of the fund has to be agreed by Tynwald. And in the past, with the building of Nobles Hospital, that got really quite controversial, that it wasn't paid back.
And that's really quite important to stress, because there had been suggestions from some of your colleagues, one colleague in particular, that this debate was potentially opening up the fund for significant raids to effectively to cover the shortfalls in government expenditure, particularly in relation to the health department.
No, I think we do need to look at the NHS allocation and see if it's still enough. Because again, that some of the calculations there haven't changed, and yet we know that with an aging population and a more complex health system, we can do so much more for so many people. So I think we need to look at that NHS allocation. But it's absolutely right that the fund should be ring fenced, and it should not be able to be raided by any Treasury Minister in the future. We've got over £1 billion there. It is invested. We have an investment committee. We use some of the best investment firms, both on Ireland and off Ireland, to invest this and get a decent return. And that goes up and down according to the markets. And that investment we report each year. Some of it goes into stocks and shares. Some of it is property. Some of it is gilts. So there's a whole range of investments. But a lot of that is off Ireland. And I would like to perhaps get to a point whereby we can invest some of that money on all island schemes that will give a decent return. It will keep the pensions going, to actually make sure that some of the infrastructure we've got here is on a par with the adjacent isle. For instance, we have some property funds. I don't know whether we own a couple of shopping centres or parts of shopping centres in the UK, because those are all aggregated funds. But surely we could use some of that money to invest in our own country, get the return. This isn't revenue spending, it's an investment in bricks and mortar here. And these are very similar conversations to the ones Rachel Reeves gave at the Mansion House address this week, in terms of looking at where things are invested, trying to get some of it invested for the people who paid in, at the same place where those people live, rather than all right the way across the world in various stock markets.
There could be some people listening to this programme that will say, OK, you're 2 Tynwalds in now to your 4th year in office, and you're opening up a conversation. Government seems to be quite good at conversations and strategies and policy papers. Isn't it time that some of this stuff was actually being decided and delivered?
And it will be. So the debate in November Tynwald is about the report. it's having this conversation. And again, thank you very much for inviting me on, because I'd like people to read this and go under the headlines a little bit and understand some of the complexities of what we're dealing with. This is, I think, an absolutely fiscally responsible way of looking at things and saying, the fund's going to run out. The date the fund's going to run out is coming closer and closer. We need to do something about this. And this is based on the last actuarial report that was published in Tynwald and given to Tynwald members last year. And so we've spent the time between then and now looking at the various options. What we've also said in this report is I will be coming back with a further report before the budget next year. And then we will carry on this conversation at the budget next year, because, as you say, I've been saying for quite a while now, we need to start making what may be seen as difficult decisions, but they are, in my opinion, the right decisions, and I want to make sure that those are explained and understood and accepted by the other members of Tynwald.
And I'm guessing nobody is going to thank you in 20, 30 years' time for not making difficult decisions and then finding the fund runs out. In terms then of this conversation, and this is the sort of final point really, how do people listening to this programme, how do they feed back their views?
Yeah, I mean, what I would really value is if people go on to the Tynwald website, or perhaps you could add it as a link to your website. Have a look at the report itself. It's relatively short. It explains the NI system, where we're at, where we could go.
An easy read too.
We've tried to make it accessible, because some of the long GAD reports are 80, 90 pages and very, very technical. This is, I think, relatively easy to read. It explains where we're at, explains the various different options. I've already had quite a few emails to myself personally saying, please don't reduce my pension, particularly from women who went through the WASPI era, who say, look, you've made me work for longer, now you want to slash my pension. No, I don't. And I do apologise for those previous decisions about not the decision to make the retirement age the same for men and women, but the way it was brought in, and sometimes the lack of communication and understanding at the time. And obviously there's a UK report, and hopefully they'll be debating that in their parliament in the near future in terms of what we do to try to redress some of that. But if people could look at this and listen to the debate and feed into their own MHKs and tell them their own aspirations for the future, their fears for the future, but also perhaps their aspirations for the island in general, and the fact that we need to have a sustainable, significantly sized NI funds that can pay for the pensioners now, but also those pensioners in the future.
That was Ramsey MHK, Alex Allinson. What does former Treasury Minister Eddie Teare make of the discussion?
I haven't got a great deal to say really, and I wouldn't want to criticise, because you never know what it's like unless you're in his shoes at the time, although I have been in that position some time past. In 2016, our administration, Alan Bell's administration, decided that the triple lock was going to cause problems, and there's also issues with the rapid increase in the retirement age for women, which I thought wasn't fair. So I went down to London, saw the then UK Pensions Minister, Ros Altman, and discussed the position with her. And we agreed that we would break the link with the UK to give us flexibility and freedom, which Minister Allinson referred to. And the intention was that when we came back in 2016, although I didn't stand again, nor did Alan Bell, that we would take steps to break the triple lock, to take steps to soften the rapid increase in the state pension age for women. So there'd be a quid pro quo, but it would also put the fund on a more sustainable basis. And I must admit, I'm disappointed it's taken 8 years for this to come to the fore again, because it was quite clear from the UK government actuarial reports into the stability of our NHI fund that it was going to reach tipping point unless we did something about it. And I was disappointed in a way that the first decisions of the 2016 administration and the 21 administration was to continue the triple lock for the duration of the administration. And I wonder how many members had the time or the opportunity to have a look at the data to enable them to make an informed decision.
Do you think people do really understand how perilous the situation is? Because I think at times, all politicians want to have their cake and eat it, don't they? Nobody wants to be taking unpopular decisions, and pensioners tend to have a stronger voice in that they turn out in greater numbers to vote. So the last thing you want to do is decrease their pension increases. If you want to still be an MHK in future years, as John Rimington discovered, describing pensioners as a drain on society wasn't a long-term prospect if you if you fancied staying in politics.
No, I can see that, and I sympathise with him, but where I possibly had the advantage, I wasn't a career politician. What I wanted to see was fairness, equity across the generations, so that I could look into the eyes of the next generation and the generation after that and say, look, we are building a sustainable future for you. But as things stand, in my humble opinion, now, we can't do that. And that's not fair. There has to be fairness. And what we have to recognise is that in 1948, when this new, at the time, pension scheme was set up, the average man drew a pension for 6 months, the average female for about 11 years. Nowadays, the average in longevity has evened out at about 81. So both male and female are drawing a pension for a considerable number of years. But, and it's a capital but, the system hasn't changed, but longevity, the circumstances have. And that needs to be addressed.
And absolutely, what you're not saying is it's a bad thing that people are living longer. What you are saying is if we are to continue to pay pensions, then we have to find a proper system, amend the current system to make sure it acknowledges changing circumstances.
Well, as I went back earlier, it has to be sustainable. Now, if we develop a system that is sustainable, then we can park that, it's done, and we can move on and only revisit it in the future if circumstances change again. And I suppose this is a reflection going back over 50 years or so. There was never any steps taken to review it as the circumstances changed, and that's criticism of generations of politicians.
And we are talking really big numbers here, and possibly this is one of the reasons why the public and indeed many MHKs struggle to get their heads round this. I mean, £250 million, give or take, is spent every year on effectively pensions. We're talking about a fund that has over £1 billion in it. They are big numbers, but what is particularly concerning is the rate at which that fund is likely to reach its peak and then diminish. I think initially when we'd made some changes over the 5-10 years previous to the 2016 election. Those changes certainly don't seem to have had a dramatic impact on the sustainability of the fund.
No, and that's why something more radical is required now, Phil. And in my humble opinion, we should protect the pensioner's standard of living by linking it to inflation. And I was a bit disappointed in a way, but I can understand why it was done. There was no more specific proposals in that report, which is going to Tynwald. I would have sort of said, well, these are the options, and if we do option A, this is going to be the outcome, and the UK Government Actuarial Service could give government advice on that, and then we could just lay out the options and the consequences of those options, and then it could go out for an informed debate.
And I suppose what the Minister is saying is actually what he's trying to do is open up a national conversation so that people can actually understand a little bit more about it before ultimately it's going to be down to him and the Treasury members to make a decision and council of ministers will be involved prior to the budget, and they'll then announce, actually, this is what we're going to do.
But if you're asking people to form a view, you need to give them data to enable them to form that view. I think it's not fair to say, we want your opinions, but not to give them any information, because Treasury will have the information through the UK government actuarial report. Now, that should be shared with the public. I know from my time there and from other actual actuarial reports I've seen in my current life, it's not an easy read. But there's always the executive summary at the start, and that gives people a good steer. And if you want a bit more information, just delve in the back pages.
And what do you think of the suggestion that we should be investing our national insurance fund in infrastructure that's in the Isle of Man, rather than investing in, a shopping? I think the minister described a shopping mall somewhere in England. Rather than doing that, build a car park in the Isle of Man.
I would need a very strong argument to do that, Phil. The reason is that if we invest in the UK, it's a much bigger economy, so we can diversify the risk more easily. Investing in the Isle of Man, you have what they call a concentration of risk. There is an argument to say we should invest some of the funds in the Isle of Man. I concede that, but from a risk point of view, I think it's a difficult one to justify, because trustees of any pension fund have to act in the interests of the pensioners and or the best interests of the pensioners. And I think it would be difficult to argue that this was the best interest of the pensioners.
And I suppose that's a fair point. But if we're talking about £1 billion, well, more than £1 billion worth of national insurance payers' money, surely a small proportion of that could be invested in Manx infrastructure that will ultimately pay back in the future.
Well, if you took, say, 40 or 50 million in domestic terms, that's a big chunk. And what you need to be careful of too is eggs in one basket on the Isle of Man. And the other thing too is distorting the Isle of Man marketplace. Our investment in the UK would definitely not distort the UK market, but I suggest we had to be careful the scope and the size and the scale of the investment they make in the Isle of Man didn't destabilise the Isle of Man's market.
I suppose the other way of looking at this is it perhaps demonstrates a failure of government to be able to attract the private sector investment that when they started off in office they were so keen to actually deliver.
Well, as an analogy to that, I've noticed in the last couple of months that Guernsey is also advertising for new residents, and their strapline is stable taxation. And I think really I can see why government brought in the 2% increase in income tax, which is really a 10% increase in taxation, that it's actually harmed our credibility, in my opinion. And once you do that, it's very difficult to get your credibility back again.
Because effectively, national insurance is a tax. It's a tax on employment, the same as income tax. And in a way, well, yes, the income is treated slightly differently in as much as how it can be used, but it's still effectively a tax. And, the 2% on income tax, perhaps that could have been avoided if what Minister Allinson is suggesting could have been done, which is change the formula which looks at how much of national insurance income can be spent on health services.
Well, I think there's an argument to do that. In my day, it was, top of my head, was 16%, I think, of the NHI fund, NHI income, which could be paid direct for NHI. And as drugs, procedures and everything else got more expensive, there's an argument to review that. As long as it doesn't destabilise the fund again, because the NHI contributions are to pay for a myriad of benefits, including health. But I think too that they should have a look at the position of older people who are still working and over retirement age. If you're over retirement age as an employee, you don't pay NHI contributions. Now, I would quite happily pay, because that really is a reflection on my good luck. You know, I'm able to work, I can work, don't have any serious health issues, so I should contribute because I've been a lucky bunny.
Marks out of 10 for the Minister?
I would give him some reasonable marks, say 6 out of 10. In GCSE he's got a pass anyway. But what I'd say is that the action should have been taken, in my opinion, earlier, and there should be more specific proposals supported by independently verified data to enable people to feedback fact-based opinions.
Former MHK for Ayr, Eddie Teare. So what do you think? What's more important to you? Keep the triple lock and risk future pensions, or accept slightly smaller increases and provide stability to the future? Will you be considering the proposal and making your views known to your MHKs, or are you happy to leave these important decisions to Tynwald? Perhaps you're getting fed up with more debates, reports and conversations and are looking for some action as we head into the 4th year of government's term in office. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Myers and Geisha Crum. Thanks for listening.